wonderful to welcome all of you to the University of Washington, of course, to the 2026 History Lecture Series. My name is Paul Rucker. I'm the Executive Director of the Alumni Association, and many of you in this room I know well and have seen over many of these years. In 1975, the UW Alumni Association and the Department of History came together to start the History Lecture Series when Professor Giovanni Costigan was required to retire due to a mandatory age requirement. For 15 years, Professor Costigan thrilled audiences in the History Lecture Series, and since then, the most distinguished faculty from the department have engaged in this winter tradition, and the Alumni Association has been thrilled to be a partner through the decades. As a history alum and as a team member here at the university, I have the pleasure and the honor to see this community come together to do great things. In the moment that we are in, the study of history, the reflection, the opportunity to be together, to build community, to recognize that America's public higher education institutes are anchors in our democracy. The study of history, yes, I agree. I was pleased to hear Department Chair Adam Warren mention that history student enrollment has increased with the recent new administration. Not surprising. We need to understand where we have been to know where we are going. But just to reflect on the power and strength of this community and what it means for University of Washington graduates and supporters and friends to come together, our alumni community, 600,000 strong, most of whom are right here in Western Washington. Think about the opportunity for public engagement and public scholarship. The Alumni Association, 137 years of convening. The members that make these programs possible, so many of you are members of the Alumni Association. I want to thank you for that decision. And I want to invite all of you who are not members to consider joining, supporting programs like the History Lecture Series, our support for current students and career services and public scholarship. We are so pleased to have an Alumni Association that recognizes that public higher education and this institution are instrumental for our safe and healthy future. So thank you for coming back to campus. We've got an incredible series of lectures over the weeks ahead, and how fortunate are we to have one of the most incredible history departments in higher education. Please join me in welcoming Professor Adam Warren, Chair of the History Program, to share more about this year's series. Thank you, everyone.
This is the night of many introductions. It won't be like this every week. Good evening. As Paul mentioned, my name is Adam Warren, and I am chair of the Department of History here at the University of Washington. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2026 History Lecture Series. I am delighted that we can gather each Wednesday this month to hear from 4 of the University of Washington's outstanding historians whose research spans the ancient world to the 21st century. My introductory comments this evening will be brief, I promise, as I'm well aware that you are not here to hear from me. I would like to begin, however, by doing a couple of things. First, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington and the Department of History acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. While this year's 4 lectures do not center Indigenous histories, I invite you to familiarize yourselves with the Indigenous-focused work of the excellent faculty, staff, and students in the University of Washington's Department of American Indian Studies, the Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies, the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture, and the Department of History's own Center for the Study of the Pacific Northwest. The University of Washington is known for punching above its weight in much of what it does. And this is especially true of our friends and colleagues in Indigenous studies, a thriving interdisciplinary field that is deserving of the public's support. Second, I would like to thank 4 groups who are key to making the History Lecture Series possible. First and foremost, we would not be here tonight if it were not for the many friends of the Department of History whose generosity supports our work. You know who you are, and I thank you for believing in what we do and enabling us to keep this 51-year tradition alive. If you are interested in donating to the series, please feel free to use the QR code that appears in the slides preceding each talk and that also appears on the back of this card that you received when you came in. Second, I would like to thank the University of Washington Alumni Association, which provides crucial financial support for this event. This is a relationship that we cherish, and it is one that goes back many years. Third, this series relies on a group of student volunteers who are staffing the event tonight and will be doing so throughout the month. I'm grateful for their help. And finally, I would like to acknowledge the staff of the Department of History who plan and coordinate the History Lecture Series. My assistant, Nick Grawl, leads that process from start to finish with the help of many of his co-workers. In a year when staff layoffs are happening across the College of Arts and Sciences and within the Department of History itself, I want to thank History's loyal staff for the key role they play in our public-facing work and so many other things. Let's please give them a round of applause. So this year's History Lecture Series speakers asked me to speak briefly about the theme, the series theme, in order to frame what you will hear tonight and over the course of this month. So here it goes. What can the spaces, practices, and lived experiences of incarceration tell us about the societies in which they developed and occurred? This question is a valuable one. And it is one we might ask ourselves about our own country today. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, the United States has the highest per capita rate of incarceration of any democracy globally. Our self-proclaimed land of the free is home to approximately 4% of the world's total human population, but we incarcerate over 20% of the world's prisoners. We live at a time, moreover, when political debates call into question the widespread expansion, not just of prisons in the United States, but also of immigrant detention centers and other institutions of confinement and social segregation and removal. Incarceration, however, is not just a phenomenon of the present and the recent past. It has a much longer history that invites comparison. This year's History Lecture Series, Power and Punishment, Histories of Incarceration, aims to do that comparative work for us. Our speakers' presentations will examine incarceration in the distant and recent past in a variety of ways, but a series of questions cut across their work and are worth introducing here. First, how do practices of incarceration in the modern world resemble or differ from those that came before them? In what ways can we see our practices and ourselves reflected in the past? And in what ways is incarceration in the distant past something deeply foreign to us? Related to this question is a question Mark Letteney, our speaker tonight, will engage. Did the modern world give birth to the prison as a uniquely modern institution? Or did similar institutions precede it in the past? Next, how do we grapple with the past acceptance of carceral practices that we now see as fundamentally unjust? And to what degree have we moved on from those unjust practices and the rhetoric used to justify them? Should we think of the history of incarceration as charting a continuous, if problematic, evolution of practices, technologies, and institutions from ancient to modern times that become more fair, more humane, and more just? Or is the history of incarceration better understood as a history of disconnected processes and ruptures that reveal enduring injustices and inequities? Finally, what can the lives of those who were incarcerated and the records they left behind teach us? Can the history of incarceration shed light on alternative futures that are possible for us and for those who are behind bars? I can think of no better people to tackle these questions than our team of speakers in this series, beginning with tonight's speaker, Professor Mark Letteney, an assistant professor of history at the University of Washington, Seattle, and ending with Dan Berger, Professor Dan Berger, adjunct professor of history at the University of Washington, Seattle, and professor of comparative ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. I would now like to invite Dan to the stage to introduce Mark. Thank you, welcome again, and enjoy the series.
Good evening. Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, and I want to do so not by reciting his impressive CV, but by talking a little bit more, following Adam's lead, about the stakes of the conversation that I see not only in tonight's lecture, but in Dr. Letteney's work more broadly. While I won't claim to speak for any of the other presenters in this series, I have long believed that prison explains the world. Whether we're talking about labor, race, economy, sex, art, or a myriad of other topics, there's no issue that is not, in some meaningful way, an issue about imprisonment. Even when our attention might be more immediately focused elsewhere, the prison lurks behind. We need to look no further than the news stories that preoccupy us today, from Palestinians languishing in Israeli prisons, Iranian dissidents in the notorious Evin prison, or the tens of thousands of immigrants in this country being kidnapped and held in one of a growing number of detention centers run by private prison companies or sent to the infamous CCOP prison in El Salvador. The prison is at the heart of everything urgent about the world. And in light of some of the statistics that Adam previewed, it is tempting, if not, or at least understandable, to see the prison as a particularly American problem. To paraphrase Martin Luther King, himself no stranger to being incarcerated, the greatest purveyor of incarceration today is our own government. And the consequences are both far-reaching and horrific. And yet, however much this country has innovated the form, the United States did not invent prison. In fact, as tonight's lecture makes clear, many of the defining features of prison were evident in Rome nearly 2,000 years ago. In his excellent new book, Ancient Mediterranean Incarceration, Dr. Letteney and his co-author, Matthew D.C. Larson, find archaeological and documentary evidence of prisons across the region. As they write, quote, "The modern prison is not a new construction, but an old and haunted house, full of apparitions of terror and subjugation that linger," end quote. Many of the components of what we in this country have grown to call mass incarceration, including solitary confinement, criminal sentencing, and economic investment and punishment, were evident in some fashion in the ancient world. As Adam Gopnik recently wrote of Dr. Letteney's book in The New Yorker, quote, "The conversation between antiquity and modernity, this new study implicitly argues, is real and constructive," end quote. Now, there is no straight line from ancient Rome to modern times, but nor are they unrelated. To look at ancient incarceration is to better understand the prison's rise and development, the depths of its allures and terrors. It allows us to better ask what binds us to the past and what we might need to free ourselves from for a better future. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Mark Letteney, is the Carol Thomas Endowed Professor of Ancient History at the University of Washington. A graduate of Princeton University, he has written widely about the ancient world, including early Christianity, the law, and material culture. Though he studies the ancient world, his approach to this scholarship is thoroughly modern. Both Ancient Mediterranean Incarceration and his first book, The Christianization of Knowledge in Late Antiquity, which won the 2024, I'm going to not pronounce this correctly, Lautenschlager Award, and was shortlisted for 2 other book prizes, were published as open access ebooks, as well as being published in physical form. And as he will address tonight, he and his co-author have made much of the evidence they relied on in their recent book available online so that we might all enhance our familiarity with the ancient institution that all too tragically still defines our times. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Letteney for his talk, Roman Prisons and the Mirror of History.
Thank you to Adam for framing our work here in this series of lectures. Turn myself down a little bit. And thank you to Nick Grahl, without whom none of this would be possible. And thanks to Dan for a really lovely introduction. I look forward to talking with you more at the conclusion of my remarks. And thank you all for coming out on this Wednesday evening. It really is an honor to speak to you all today, and I hope that I can offer something of value in the next 45 minutes or so. So, I'm going to begin this lecture by breaking the rules. Typically, addresses like this are most successful when they skip over the historiography, putting to the side for one moment the way that historians have approached these questions in the past. And we're instructed instead to jump right over into the history itself, into the analysis of primary sources, and to the construction of a narrative from that evidence. There's good reason for that, not least because being subjected to a litany of prior opinions is a drag for the audience and a liability for the presenter at very best. But I'm going to begin this lecture with just a bit of historiography, explaining to you how a few prior historians and theorists have thought about the issue of pre-modern incarceration. I promise it will be quick, and it will be at least as painless as I can possibly make it. But I want to convince you first that the way that historians have thought about the prison's past matters for our understanding of the evidence itself and for understanding contemporary debates about the nature of incarceration in our own day. But to begin, the most common fact about the prison that you'll hear repeated is that the prison is utterly novel. In his influential Prison Worlds, sociologist Didier Fesson writes on page 1, quote, "Prison is a recent invention." This is one example out of hundreds that I could have chosen in which historians and sociologists repeat a claim that is so common that it's become something of a bedrock principle. So, what is the prison, and is it a recent invention? As the sociologist Ashley Rubin defines them, quote, "Prisons are government-sanctioned facilities designed for the long-term confinement of adults as punishment for serious offenses." Here in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Criminology and Criminal Justice, Rubin is merely repeating a long-held and well-attested conclusion that this definition of prisons emerged relatively late in human history. For most of Western history, incarceration played a minor role in the punishment and was often reserved for elites or political offenders. However, it was rarely considered punishment in its own right for most offenders. The notion of prison as a place of punishment emerged gradually, according to most accounts, over the 17th through the 19th centuries. The corollary to this idea that the prison is a modern invention is the notion that in the pre-modern world, there was no such thing as a prison. Instead, the story goes, in the 17th century or so, or before the 17th century or so, there were only jails. Jails are places where people are held before punishment, while awaiting trial or some other form, usually of corporal punishment. But jails are not places of punishment themselves. The basic story is this. Before the modern period, there were jails, but no prisons. If there was no prison in the pre-modern world, as is commonly thought, then to search for a pre-modern prison is to commit a category error, like looking for democracy in ancient Babylonia or searching for the Roman Empire's version of a cotton gin. Now, there are a number of reasons that the ancient prison has been relatively difficult to access, but it's hard to overstate the influence of Theodore Mommsen, at least as regards the Roman evidence. And note the hair. Mommsen's 1899 Roman criminal law is still the foundational work touching on Roman prisons. His analysis has been expanded and updated, but as far as most legal historians are concerned, his conclusions have not been overturned. His conclusions are as follows. Romans had no coherent legal doctrine of limited term incarceration, and they didn't often prescribe the use of prisons as punishment. As a result, they had no normative practice of it. Mommsen argued that Romans only had jails, but not prisons. That is, that Romans used carceral facilities sparingly to hold prisoners on their way to punishment, but that incarceration was rare, it was brief, and it was never used as punishment itself. Mommsen was tremendously influential. And throughout the 20th century, if you were to ask just about any Roman historian or legal historian, did the Romans have prisons? They would typically confidently answer, no. This has been well established. It's the answer I would have given until recently. This is the answer that was picked up by Michel Foucault in his epoch-making 1975 book, translated in 1977 as Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prison. This book is a foundation of much work in carceral studies still today, and in it, Foucault demonstrates in unmistakable terms that in the modern prison, we can see the expression of power most clearly, but that the form that power takes in the prison is not fundamentally different than it does in other institutions of modernity. The sanatorium, the school, the factory, and even the home model a form of social relations which are most visible in the prison only because in the prison, power is expressed most clearly. Foucault argued that by studying the prison, we could understand something fundamental about the nature of post-Enlightenment life. It was a petri dish in which we could see power in its crystalline form. Foucault's book is not truly or fundamentally a history of incarceration. His subtitle, however, has in some ways overdetermined the reception of his work. It asserts, as you can see, the quote-unquote birth of the prison, again implying that before the early modern period, there was no such institution. The reason it's important to understand this historiography is because so much contemporary scholarship on the prison relies on the fundamental insight that the prison is an outgrowth of modernity. The corollary, then, is also true. That if we as a society can address the problems of modernity, or of racial capitalism, or of rugged individualism, or statist liberalism, or any other such structure, then maybe we can fix the problem of the prison. If the prison is a symptom of modernity, then we need to fix the problem of modernity. However, if this premise is not true, and the prison as a place of state punishment has a history not of centuries, but of millennia, then today we need new models for thinking about the relationship between the past of the prison and a possible, more just future. What I want to convince you of today is that the prison indeed existed in the Roman Empire and even significantly before. It was a place of punishment. Lawyers and emperors intended it as such, and individuals experienced it as a form of punishment, and often punishment whose period was calibrated to the nature and the severity of their alleged crime. So I'm planning to introduce you to some evidence for this claim, evidence like this stele, which was given by an enslaved temple worker in the middle of the 2nd century CE. Theodorus lived in modern-day Western Turkey and was convicted of a series of sexual crimes. Upon release, he set up this stone in thanks to Zeus, recording his ordeal. It reads, Theodorus saying, "I have Zeus as my legal advocate," and Zeus responds, "Behold, I have blinded him in consequence for his actions, but now he has made good his mistakes by propitiating the gods and by erecting an inscribed stele." Asked by the council, Zeus replies, "I am merciful because my stele was erected on the day I appointed. You may open the prison. I release the condemned after 1 year and 10 months have passed." Evidence like this will point to 6 aspects of the Roman carceral apparatus that are salient for thinking comparatively about the ancient world and about the contemporary world. At the end of the lecture, I'm going to suggest what I think this evidence is good for. Now, don't get too excited. I'm not going to make any policy proposals. But I think that we can learn from this data and employ it if we pay close attention precisely to the difference and distance between the ancient prison and our own, and that doing so has the possibility of offering a mirror to us. in which we can see our own choices around incarceration at a new angle. So to begin, there are 6 aspects of the Roman prison that I want to highlight. They are centrality, domination, surveillance, permeability, danger, and economic integration. These arguments are based on a book that I wrote with Matthew D.C. Larson titled Ancient Mediterranean Incarceration, and you'll see that many of the slides have a letter and a number combination. If you plug that code into the website at historyofincarceration.com, you can explore much of the data that I'll present today. So all of the papyri are translated. There are 3D models available for you to walk through on your computer or a VR headset if you have one. And there are commentaries which I hope will help you to contextualize this ancient material and see interconnections between a disparate archive. So the first theme I want to focus on is centrality. The pins on this map are all locations that we'll visit today. And I want to start in the city of Rome, which is marked in red here on the western coast of the Italian peninsula. This is a 3D reconstruction of the Roman Forum as it looked at its architectural height in the 4th century CE. This is the social, commercial, and administrative center of the city of Rome, and at this point, it had served that function for nearly 1,000 years. For 700 of those years, residents of the city could walk through the Forum en route to a religious festival, a government event, or grocery shopping, perhaps stopping here on the right to marvel at the Roman Senate building constructed by the first Emperor Augustus. While doing so, they would walk directly by one of the city's prisons, right here, the Carcer Tullianum, one of at least 7 prison facilities in the city at this time, most of which were directly in or adjacent to this central district. Around the same time this new Senate building was being built, the architect Vitruvius proposed that all Roman cities ought to be built in this way, in imitation of the imperial center. In his treatise on architecture, he writes, the treasury, the prison, and the Senate house should abut the Forum, but in such a way that their scale and proportion answers to that of the Forum. If you're going to build a Roman city, a prison ought to stand at its center. This model was not only prescribed by architects, but it appears in new Roman cities across the Mediterranean even long before Vitruvius wrote. For instance, Romans built a new city called Cosa on the western coast of Italy in the 3rd century BCE. It was a military foundation, first and foremost, built to settle veterans, and it included a forum at its center, in imitation of that at Rome. Here is their forum at the center of the city, and just off the corner of the forum, a small prison built at the same time as that forum. Here's a reconstruction. And I'll note that it shares remarkable architectural features with the civic prison at Rome that we just glimpsed very briefly. In both, stout walls secure a space that is divided into 2, an upper room, one for a guard and one for prisoners, we think, and a lower room. This general model was repeated throughout the Mediterranean. Roman city centers had at least one prison, and often many more. And prisoners were inescapably present in the public lives of cities. You could not walk through the center of a city without knowledge of the prison, and ancient residents had the ability to look through the windows into these facilities, gazing on the faces of often hungry, emaciated public prisoners who would be begging for sustenance. Putting together all of the archaeologically attested sites of incarceration that Matthew Larson and I have identified, we find that the architecture of securely identified Roman prisons reflects an ideology of state domination. State domination literally over the bodies of prisoners. So let's move south to our 3rd location, the ancient city of Quiquel, in the modern-day city of Jamila, Algeria. The civic prison at Quiquel was constructed in the middle of the 2nd century CE. As we might expect, it directly abuts the Forum, and it lies underneath the basilica, the civic courthouse. It's a basement prison with only one entrance that opens directly to the city's main public street, known as the Cardo Maximus. Here's a view of the prison today from the other side of the main street, with the remains of the courthouse above. Here's a 3D model that I made when I visited in 2019. Going inside the prison, you see an antechamber for a guard, and on either side, there's a significant threshold and a gate. Inside, there are 2 rooms. A first room, which has some light, that stands underneath a concrete and rubble cross-vault with benches around the perimeter. And another gate allowed access to an inner room, which looks lighter because the ceiling has fallen in, but which would have had almost zero natural light in antiquity. Returning to the city's main street, you can see that a back entrance to the courthouse allows immediate access between the prison below and the judicial chambers above. Here's a drawing of the site. The courthouse above is the place where judges handed down pronouncements to loose and to bind prisoners. At Queekle, and in many other civic facilities, the place of judgment is above the place of confinement. This is a theme that reverberates throughout our sources, and I want to stress that part of the ideology of Roman carcerality that we can read from these civic prisons is the power of the state literally over incarcerated bodies. Even when civic prisons are not physically underneath the seat of judicial power, we still see this theme repeated of judgment above and bodies below. For instance, we find another example of this theme if we move north to the Algerian coast to a city called Tipasa, which is another Roman city that was inhabited at the same time of that Queekle was at its heyday inland. This is the mosaic of the captives. In the 2nd century CE, it decorated the floor of the civic courthouse at Tipasa. In fact, it decorated the floor directly underneath where judges sat in judgment. Here again, we see the theme of civic judgment over bodies. Rather than having the prison underneath judicial chambers, like at Queekle, at Tipasa, they decorated the apse of the courthouse with the bodies of captives. Here, a native Berber family to judge by the women's hair and dress. The man and the child behind are stripped, and they all have their hands bound. Rather than sitting above the prison itself, judges at Tipasa pronounced verdicts over a depiction of vanquished bodies. As I've just suggested, by looking at depictions of prisoners, I think we can learn something about how the image-consuming public perceived prisons and prisoners. And a regular feature of these depictions is surveillance, prisoners being looked over by guards. One such image appears in actually 3 different private homes at Pompeii, which is a city that was destroyed by a volcanic eruption in the year 79 CE. Here's one version of that image that proliferated at Pompeii. On the left is a fresco discovered on the wall of a private home in Pompeii, and on the right is a drawing of that same fresco as it looked when it was uncovered in the 19th century before it degraded. The fresco depicts a common Roman myth about the virtue of piety towards one's parents. In the myth, a parent, sometimes called Mikon, is sentenced to starve to death in a prison, and in order to save her parent, Pero travels to the prison regularly to breastfeed them. When she's discovered, her selfless act is rewarded with his release. Here we are voyeurs, along with the guard, at the moment of discovery. A guard looks down through the window, light shining in from above to the prison below, catching the daughter red-breasted. It is important to remember that these 3 homeowners at Pompeii chose to depict a prison on their walls not because they wanted to have an image of incarceration, but rather as a reminder of the great virtue of filial piety. This Roman prison is simply a stage upon which the mythical drama plays out. But it is precisely such incidental representations that give us access to the typical images that might pop into a Roman's mind when you spoke of the prison. In the same way, the Netflix show Orange is the New Black represents the closest that many contemporary Americans will ever get to the inside of a prison facility. And as a result, the show's depictions of prisoners form a part of a common cultural ideal about what these places look like and what they are like. In serialized depictions like this, we can glimpse something of the public transcript of incarceration in the Roman world. And one fundamental aspect of that common image is that prisoners were under surveillance. Surveillance is also built into the architecture of prison spaces. So next we're going to move to Corinth in Greece and look at the late Roman prison there. Here's a 3D model made by me and a reconstruction by Niels Bargfeld depicting the late Roman prison of Corinth, which my co-author Matthew Larson securely identified just a couple of years back as the prison of Corinth. This space is directly on the Forum. Until the 4th century or so, it was a series of shops. And the prison seems to have been underneath the courthouse nearby, as we might expect. But when the courthouse was destroyed by an earthquake in the early 4th century, these shops on the Forum were renovated to serve as the city's new prison. One of the ways that we know that this was a prison is the dozens of graffiti which decorate the floors and walls of this space, mostly in Greek. A graffiti like this one, which reads, "May fortune overcome for the one toiling in this lawless place. Lord, show no mercy to the person who threw us in here." This evidence brings us about as close as we can get to an actual ancient prisoner. In this case, a prisoner scratched a curse on the floor of their prison, which tells us something about how they viewed the place where they were held. It's a lawless place. In these graffiti, we get to hear the voices of prisoners. And what they're asking for more than anything else is release and justice. Outside, we see a common feature of prisons from the Roman imperial period, a window, allowing both prisoners to look out and receive items from people walking through the Forum, which I'll discuss in a moment. But equally, these windows allow for surveillance of deviant people without having to open the door and compromise the security of the space. At Corinth, we see another fundamental aspect of the Roman carceral regime. These spaces are permeable. The window allowed for people to come by and care for prisoners, a directive common in early Christian sources especially, for instance, in teaching in Matthew's Gospel from the late 1st century CE, in which Jesus speaks in the guise of a king, offering curses to those who failed to care for him in his time of need. "I was a stranger and you did not welcome me, naked and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison and you did not visit me." How were people visiting prisoners? Well, there's some evidence for regular visiting hours, but best we can tell, most of the time visitors interacted with prisoners through these small windows, which appear regularly in literary sources speaking of prisoners and in archaeologically attested spaces that seem to serve as prisons, like this one here at Corinth. The import of feeding prisoners wasn't apparent only to Christians. It is, in fact, quite well attested. In the early 1st century BCE, the late 1st century BCE, a mother wrote to her children to remind them to feed people that she had imprisoned herself. Truphas writes, quote, "to Athenodorus, her son, and Artemis, her daughter." In this case, we see another aspect of the carceral system in Roman Egypt, the common use of cash bail. Here, this woman owes a debt for which she was liable to be imprisoned if she could not provide collateral to secure her release. The collateral she provided was human, people that she had enslaved who sat in a prison facility while she played the grain markets. She writes, "Each day I'm pestered by 2 bailiffs, Socrates and Elamon, because I'm found owing. I have often written to you to care for the slaves. They will die in the prison." It was the permeability of these spaces that Truphas relied upon while she waited for the price of grain to rise. In the meantime, she could send her son to feed her prisoners, only if he would remember to do so. The permeability of these spaces was not an innovation of the Roman period. In earlier Hellenistic Egypt, we hear of many, many prisoners who rely on the public nature of these places to ensure their survival through an ordeal that could last for weeks, months, or even years. So, for instance, here is a papyrus from someone who calls himself, quote, Phaenesis the grain measurer. He writes to a local bigwig named Zenon. He says, "It is now 3 months since Dionysiodorus saw me and ordered me to be taken to prison. Will you kindly send one of your people along with the messenger who hands you this letter, because I have no one in this city? and send me a cloak or some money, as much as you please, to serve down until one of my folk sails down. Phenesis was an out-of-towner, and he writes that it will take a while for his family to arrive to take care of him during his incarceration. He asks, in the meantime, for two things: a cloak and some money. What is the cloak for? Presumably, Phenesis is cold, likely in an underground space. And what's the money for? It's so he can buy food. More than anything else, in these letters from prisoners, we hear about their needs. Needs that they expect can be met because they're accessible, even when incarcerated. Another aspect of these prisoner letters permeates the archives, one that we've already glimpsed a few times. Prisons were dangerous places to be, and prisoners knew it. Consider this desperate plea from a man named Zabatus. In the 2nd century BCE, Zabatus was incarcerated in the Seleucid city of Maresha, in modern-day Israel, and scratched a letter in Greek in a limestone slab. He begins, "Zabatus sent this from the punishments, health and life. I believe to know that I am innocently near death, since it is 3 years ago that I was arrested, and because Theon came to have my possessions, and therefore," and then it breaks off. "The request addressed to you was never sent to you, but please feel compunction with regard to this matter at once. This bond I'm in is a violent one." The very conditions of prisons were dangerous, so far as we can tell from prisoner letters like this one. But the danger was not solely environmental, as Zabatus intimates. Across the archive of documents like this one, we hear complaints about the treatment of prisoners at the hands of guards who violated them with impunity. Consider this letter, written in Coptic on the front and back of a broken potsherd at the tail end of late antiquity. Two women write to two men who remain free, while the women stay in prison as debt collateral. This is a similar situation to what we saw earlier with Truphus, who left slaves in prison while she played the grain markets. These unnamed women complain, quote, "We were at pains and wrote to you, and you have forgotten us in the captivity where we are, while they hung us up backwards and took our breath out of our bodies, and you did not visit us. For we gave our life for you. Look, you have forgotten us. Don't trust the men lest they kill us. For as the Lord lives, if you don't reach us today with the money, there will be no life left in us." Death in prison was a constant, and it seemed that when it happened, some accounting had to be made. Here's one such account, a notice from June 24th, 228 CE. And the notice was sent from, quote, "the prison guards of the Treasury Office of the governor." These guards wrote this papyrus to report that a local tax farmer, known to Romans as Aurelius Epinicus and to Egyptians as Petsarapis, quote, "was taken ill and died inside today, which is the 30th of the current month of Pauni. He lasted a short 58 days in the facility." Death in prison was a consistent concern of prisoners and, in fact, legislators alike in the Roman period. In the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine passed a number of prison reform laws, which he introduces with a rather stark pronouncement. Quote, "The prison is for punishment. The prison is for guilty people." That is, he legislates that the prison should be used exclusively, or at least primarily, for people after they are convicted. Before they're convicted, it's too dangerous to hold people just waiting for trial, along with those who have already been convicted. In the same year, another law of Constantine offers some minimum conditions for prisoners who were in jail awaiting trial, including when incarcerated, the person waiting trial must not suffer the darkness of an inner prison, but he must be kept in good health by the enjoyment of light. And when night doubles the necessity for his guard, he shall be taken back into the entrance area of the prisons and into healthful places. The idea is that he may not perish from the punishments of prison, a fate which is considered pitiable for the innocent, but not sufficiently severe for the guilty. Best we can tell, Constantine's legislation was only marginally effective, if it had any effect at all. Another half-century later, the orator Libanius drafted a long and harrowing speech and sent it to the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, complaining about the use to which prisons were being put in the metropolis of Antioch. He writes, "Now, king, you must realize that the governors sent out to the provinces are murderers. The manner of it is as follows. Lost tempers often involve numerous complaints. Someone takes umbrage. Straight away, he scurries off to the governor, alleging that he has been the victim of some insult or abuse. The other party, despite denials, claims of wrongful accusation and appeals to the law and statute, is packed off to jail, even though he has plenty to go to bail for him. This is the normal treatment of the weaker at the hands of the influential, of the penniless at the hands of the wealthy, of the masses at the hands of the elite who expect any charge they make to count for more than proof." In Libanius's portrait of the situation in 386 CE, we can see the quote-unquote prison reforms of Constantine and his sons, and that they had been a spectacular failure. Even in major cities like Antioch, the prison was being used to settle personal vendettas, to incapacitate political or economic rivals, and as a tool of the wealthy against the powerless. He continues, "In consequence, the prison is packed with bodies. No one comes out, or precious few at least, though many go in. They are doubly afflicted by the actual imprisonment and by the manner of it. They cannot get any proper sleep, for they cannot even lie down to rest. Their repose is just what they get while standing." Libanius complains that the dangerous condition of prisons meant that even people in pretrial detention were dying because of the nature of their confinement. But he had another concern as well, which is the fact that the imprisonment of one breadwinner had the regular and awful consequence of plunging entire families into desperate circumstances, including forcing women who were once reliant on a male breadwinner into panhandling or sex work to make ends meet, and to care for their incarcerated family member. Where does the food come from for all these? The soup in their pots, their few greens, and anything else beside. All of this, they say, is much below their needs. Their wives, sisters, daughters, who were supported by them before their imprisonment, must be the ones to support them now. And how, king? The women cannot possibly be better off as a result of the imprisonment of their menfolk. The consequence is that the ugly and the aged go begging, while those who have any looks at all endure every kind of outrage. For the prisoners, then, this is an even more bitter pill than their imprisonment, for they are bound to ask the source from which they get this support, and to be told it. Libanius makes clear that this situation is an outrage, and one for which mere legislation like that of Constantine, could not stem the tide. The prison was a tool of repression and a blunt form of torture and execution, whose effects rippled out among the populace, however unevenly so. But as we see in Libanius, the prison itself was an aspect of the economy, influenced by it and inflecting it at every turn. But Libanius wrote from the late 4th century CE, but the prison had been integrated within the broader Mediterranean economy at this point for at least 6 centuries. The fact is that the load-bearing bodies of prisoners were one of the engines powering the Roman economy and the Hellenistic Egyptian economy before it. Consider this papyrus, a letter from the middle of the 3rd century BCE, which illustrates the economic exploitation of prisoners by private contractors overseeing mines owned by the king. On the back, the address reads, "Notice from Horus, the stonecutter, concerning the prisoners working the aeolia," this is a unit of measure, "and concerning the mine shafts." On the front, the letter reads, "To Zenon, greetings from Horus, the stonecutter. Haraeus reports concerning the prisoners, from the 2nd of the month of Paophi until the 10th of the month of Choiak, that each man has worked 2 cubic cubits every day, there being 10 men in all. The total of cubic cubits worked is 1360. If it seems best to you, send someone who will make a measurement, for there are 130 who have not yet worked." Here we learn that over a 60-day period, 140 people were kept as prisoners at a Hellenistic Egyptian mining facility. The question is, where are these prisoners being held? Surely whatever facility they are in is definitionally a prison. And surely the fact that over a 60-day period, 130 of those 140 sat idle in that facility is a form of penal incarceration. This is a system of penal mine labor that continued in Egypt under Roman control, again showing Romans as inheritors of a system rather than innovators. For instance, consider this letter from the imperial administrator of Egypt. The document releases a man for time served in the alabaster mines, ending on December 27th, 209 CE. It reads, "From Sabatianus Aquila to Theon, the governor of the Arsinoite district, greetings. Nigiras, son of Papyrus, whom the most honorable Claudius Julianus condemned to the alabaster mine for a period of 5 years, and who has completed the time of his sentence, I released." The categories of jail, prison, and forced labor are deeply intertwined in these sources. And the fact is that we have ample evidence of Roman mining camps which were capable of holding many magnitudes more prisoners than could work in the mines at any one time, a practice that seems to continue from earlier periods, as we just saw. One such example is the mines at Simitus, the single source for the prized yellow marble, which was mined under Roman military supervision. Here is Jean-Claude Gauvon's brilliant reconstruction of Simitus, with a civilian city in the foreground, behind these mountains of yellow marble, and yet behind that, a large production facility, including a 6-bayed prison. The prison's here on the left, and one of the open mine shafts is on the right. This prison facility is capable of holding over 1,000 people under strict carceral control, in large cells with toilets inside, all within a large complex overseen by a wall, 3 gates, and a watchtower. The space was excavated by a German team in the 1970s and has been long known, but it's not been integrated into any analysis of Roman carceral practices before now because it has been seen as something other, a form of non-carceral punishment, rather than an aspect of incarceration. I argue that it is punishment, and it is a form of incarceration. The fact is that the ancient extractive economy was so thoroughly tied up in exploiting carceral labor that society simply couldn't function apart from systems of domination predicated on the prison. There is plenty more to share, but in the interest of time, I'll end with a couple final thoughts. Incarceration was a persistent social reality throughout antiquity, and like today, its ubiquity rendered it nearly transparent. There are no lessons to be learned from antiquity about a more just carceral system. As I suggested just a bit ago, more than anything else, this material points to the extraordinary durability of carceral systems across time and their fundamental imbrication with issues of class, gender, ethnicity, and imperialism. Nevertheless, seeing this evidence does give us an opportunity to learn something about our own choices. Seeing something different in the past prompts us to question categories and decisions in our own moment that we might not think to interrogate otherwise. This is what I mean by the mirror of history. I think that when deployed with analytical rigor and historical humility, these sources can form a mirror in which we can see that our choices to incarcerate our fellow members of society are just that, a choice. Further, these choices encode an ideology of punishment. Our decisions about how to incarcerate people are also choices. And by seeing different choices, we can look critically at our own world, perhaps armed with new insights, or at least sensitized to aspects that might have otherwise remained transparent. For instance, carceral systems today, by and large, are a form of social segregation. People are quite literally locked away. And society participates in a social fiction in which prisoners do not exist. This ancient evidence shows us that this is a choice. Incarceration as social death is, in fact, peculiar. We've seen that in the Roman world, prisoners were inescapably present in the social lives of cities and in the economic life of the empire. Roman prisoners were exemplary. and were placed at the center of cities precisely to show off their deviance. The American carceral system, on the other hand, places prisoners out of sight, hoping that in so doing, they will be forced out of mind. Which of these organizations of society is more just? Neither. But neither are either of these systems obvious, natural, or innocent. There's a long history to the reason that the current carceral regime looks and acts the way that it does, and the inertia of history is hard, sometimes impossible, to overcome. But it wasn't always this way. And understanding that fact alone suggests that we might be able to change our ways again. Finally, this evidence suggests that pretending that the prison is a symptom of the early modern period will lead us to seek solutions to the problem of modernity, rather than addressing a set of practices that are in evidence at least from antiquity. It is a hard truth, but the prison has always been with us. The first evidence I've seen of it is from the 24th century BCE, arising out of one of the earliest caches of written materials in existence. The prison, in other words, is not the kind of institution that is likely to have an origin to uncover or a birthday to mark. It is not an institution like democracy, which exists today in a variety of guises, each of which can be traced back to a moment of origin in Athens of the 4th century BCE. The prison is not the kind of institution that has a single point of origin. Nevertheless, it is an institution, and it is like some other institutions. Institutions like the family, or like language, or religion, or childhood, or beauty. The prison is a social construction that has been reinvented in myriad ways over time and space, and whose precise organization in our own day is the result of factors both within and beyond our control. This series of lectures aims to enlighten just some of those myriad histories. To conclude, I think that bringing archaeological and documentary sources into a single frame, along with literary and legal materials, allows us to see the scar of incarceration on the archive. A scar that's not always distinct, but one that's made visible if you look closely and on a broad spectrum. The work requires a variety of skills and specialties, and as you've seen, it stretches time, space, language, and interpretive frames. I think that the only way to do this evidence justice is collaboratively, and so I look forward to hearing from you all and to thinking through this material together. Thank you for your time.
You all know what to do to input your questions. But while those are loading, I want to ask you to start off this discussion. Why have we missed this? I mean, something we is always a dangerous pronoun to invoke here. But you've laid out some very compelling evidence about the prison in antiquity, and yet so much of common sort of knowledge about it assumes that this sort of recent invention as you started. So what accounts for that kind of discrepancy in your view?
Yeah. So I'll say that not everybody has missed this. And in fact, the work that Matthew Larson and I have done builds on a number of important studies, some of which are back here, Julia Hillner's work, Jens Uwe Krause's work, Sophia Therese-Tavar. There are a number of scholars who've looked at different aspects of incarceration in antiquity. In general, the answer is these practices have often been explained away as abuses of the prison. Libanius, when he's speaking in 386 about the plight of prisoners in Antioch, is clearly appealing to the emperor, pointing out that the prison ought not to be used this way. He doesn't necessarily say that it's illegal, but that this is an abuse. And typically the way that Roman historians have explained this evidence is as an abuse. and in its position as an abuse, therefore not intentional and not historical evidence of the sort that we could use to build a picture of society. Typically, historians have looked to ideals of incarcerators, especially ideals of lawyers, to tell them the way that the prison ought to be used, and read from that prescriptive advice a description of the world, and put aside abuses as one-offs, or sort of rotten apples, forgetting the other half of the famous bon mot, right, that one rotten apple spoils the bunch. One of the things that Matthew and I wanted to do, and the way that we wanted to sort of reread this evidence in a slightly different way, is to allow both the experience of prisoners into the discussion as knowers of the system that binds them, and when a prisoner calls their experience punishment, to believe them, and also to look at abuses of the prison not as one-offs or exceptions, but as, in fact, uses of the prison. And if abuses of the prison are widespread enough and are durative over a long enough time frame, then we can call them not abuses at all, but simply practices. And it seems to be the case that while many Roman lawyers and some emperors found the punitive use of the prison distasteful, as, well, Libanius points out, and a number of other sources do as well, abuses were rampant, and some lawyers, in fact, and emperors like Constantine thought that the prison actually should only be used for people who were post-conviction. So I think it's less of a question of the evidence, although we have brought some new evidence to the table, and more a question of how we read the evidence and whose voices we're trying to champion.
And can you talk a little bit more about the evidence? Mm-hmm. So, you know, as somebody who spends a lot of time in the 20th century in terms of historical work, going back, you know, earlier than the 19th century is a stretch for me. Yeah. And here you've gone back thousands of years. So can you talk a little bit about the gathering of evidence, yeah, both that you and your co-author did, but also, you know, that you're saying that the evidence is sort of out there and it's a matter of actually taking it seriously and engaging with it. So can you talk, yeah, a little bit about how you did that?
So we have thought about our evidence in 4 different buckets, and we've seen a little bit of all of those buckets. We have literary sources, including laws, that often describe ideal forms of prison or describe prisoners. We have documentary sources like the papyri, which are everything from lists of prisoners to requests for supplies to requests for release, bail receipts, all that sort of stuff. We have visual sources, which give us access to kind of the images that people might grasp at or use to envision what a prison might look like or how prisoners appear in society. And we have archaeological evidence, which are spaces in which either are possibly carceral or are definitely carceral. Often it's hard to tell, but we have a sort of a typology that helps out with that. And I'll say that the literary evidence has often been the star of the show, especially the literary evidence of lawyers and emperors prescribing an ideal world. And one of the things that we wanted to do, and that I try to do in this talk, is to kind of put the literary sources and the legal sources especially to the side for a moment and take seriously the other sources of evidence and see if we can, in so doing, reorient the way that we read legal sources as not descriptions of the world as it existed, but prescriptions of an ideal world that actually never existed. The actual practical nature of this involved a lot of Zoom. As I was on lockdown in Athens for a good part of this project, and my co-author was on lockdown in Princeton, in which we sat and we mostly read papyri, translated papyri, wrote commentaries on them, and I'll put another plug for the database. Many of those commentaries are now available. I've tried to pull all of the puns out of the commentaries as much as I can. And we tried to get a sense, just through looking at this documentary evidence, evidence from prisoners about their plight directly, as to sort of what the system looked like from the inside of the cage. The nice thing about that was that these papyri had been mostly edited, right? People had actually already looked at the papyrus and transcribed it. Sometimes it had been translated, which is wonderful. And we had to simply ask the question and pull together the evidence. All of those other buckets kind of worked in a similar sort of way. It wasn't that we were out there excavating any of these sites, although we did excavate a handful of these sites. And we identified a couple of these sites for the first time. But we were building on other scholarship and asking new questions of published material. And we are thankful to the work of other scholars who sort of laid the groundwork for a kind of new way of thinking about material that's maybe not well worked, but at least already somebody took a first pass at.
There's a question of whether there's any evidence during Roman history of citizens getting involved to reform prisons, and whether any of those efforts were successful.
Yeah. So Libanius, which we talked about, is one such. He is a professor of rhetoric. He's fairly close into the imperial family, or at least he has access to the imperial family in the late 4th century. And he is one such sort of prison reformer. Although what's interesting, in the reason I put his complaints about abuses of the prison in Antioch after talking about the reform movement of a couple generations earlier is to show precisely the impotence of those reforms. Even laws that attempt to outlaw the types of abuses that Libanius speaks to, coming from a powerful imperial dynasty, and Constantine's sons sort of continue on this reform track, they seem to have almost no effect. We don't have a huge amount of access to, let's say, the voices of common people. Certainly not the voices of common people speaking about the prison. We often have the voices of people who are imprisoned only because we have their letters. One of the things that's really interesting about this data set is that we happen to have, for reasons I won't go into, a cluster of legal materials and of literary materials from the 4th century, which seem to have, reflect a sort of, something like a grassroots reform organization movement. We don't have evidence for that in the 3rd century, but we also don't have the same kind of evidence. We don't have a cluster of laws. We don't have the same kind of literary sources. And everywhere you look where we happen to have legal sources and literary sources that speak to this sort of common ideals around prison, we happen to find prison reform efforts. That's probably not a coincidence. It probably is the case that people are concerned about these issues throughout the Roman imperial period at least, and that we only happen to see it in certain periods because of the nature of the sources.
So I think hopefully we have time for two more questions. One is whether ancient society, and you touched on this a little bit, but just now, but building on that, whether there's any evidence of a kind of codification of rules for how prisons were supposed to operate, or how prisons were supposed to treat incarcerated people, or was it sort of capricious at the whim of the jailer?
Yeah.
Or a bit of both might also be the case.
Yeah, so we do have legal sources that speak to sort of ideal practices. We also have some interesting documentary evidence that points to, for instance, new facilities meant to sort of shave off some of the worst excesses of the carceral system, including, I'll just bring this one up because it's interesting. So this is an inscription from Jordan, from Jerash. It's from the 6th century. And it says, Paul, our most blessed bishop, by the grace of God, raised up this holy building of the detention center because he approved it as beneficial. And in the name of the Lord, he blessed this detention center to be for all the accused, apart from the condemned, so that no person found guilty could be put there with impunity, nor anyone could be transferred from the detention center to the prison of the condemned. Okay. So what's happening here is this is a new facility that's built precisely because of the issue that Constantine points to of people who are waiting to be brought to trial, put into the general prison population, and, well, suffering because of it. The other reason I want to point out this inscription is because the typical story that we hear is, as I said at the beginning, that the jail has been around since time immemorial, places where people are held before before real punishment has been around forever, and that purpose-built prisons are an invention of modernity. This inscription actually seems to flip that completely on its head, in that it seems that the prison has been around since time immemorial, and the very first evidence that we have of a purpose-built facility meant precisely for people awaiting trial is in 539 CE. And it seems to be built precisely because of concerns that we see in Libanius in the late 4th century, concerns that we see in Constantine in the early 4th century, and concerns that we see throughout the documentary record around the nature of confinement itself being dangerous.
So I'll ask you a final question, which I think is good for you to reflect on, but also is a nice prelude and preview to the rest of the series, which we'll all be looking at different moments, different places. So if prison has always been with us, is there any time, place, past civilization where there were, quote, good prison systems?
No. I think it's a contradiction in terms. And the reason that I think that this evidence is helpful is not because it gives us models. And I told you I'm not going to give any policy proposals, and I will stick to that because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a criminologist, I'm an ancient historian. And I think that this evidence can help us see ourselves, to see the peculiarity of some of our choices around incarceration anew. But I've seen no evidence of a just form of incarceration, and that in itself, I think, is telling.
Mark, thank you so much. Thank you all.